there is a crisis and we need to respond.
The city government, the state government is making it more expensive to be a landlord.
Legislators want to change a state law that allows landlords to terminate leases without giving tenants a reason why.
I feel like it's given a little bit of power to the renter.
We need to fight to stop evictions.
Plus, Seattle city leaders are working to ban evictions during winter months.
That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
How would new laws about good cause and winter evictions affect renters and landlords?
You have to remember, this is private property.
We hear from both sides.
You're talking about life or death for folks.
Wrestling with renters' rights. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. State lawmakers are considering a bill to require landlords to give good cause when terminating a tenant's lease, as a way to prevent property managers from discriminating against certain renters. Seattle has had a similar law on the books for decades, and recently passed good cause laws in Federal Way and Burien may add some momentum to this statewide measure. But landlords say this proposal, along with a plan from the city of Seattle to ban wintertime evictions, could lead to some public safety problems and higher rents. This week, we're looking at renters' rights at the city and state levels and how this battle could affect all of us. Ginny Ferguson says renting an apartment in most parts of our state comes with a caveat you won't see on any lease agreement.
You move in and then they don't like you and you're gone.
Current state law allows landlords to terminate a renter's month-to-month lease with only a 20-day warning without giving any reason why. Ginny got such a notice last year after requesting a repair at her apartment. Soon after, she joined a community movement to fight back with a city ballot measure in Federal Way. Voters approved the so-called Stable Homes Initiative in November.
Vote yes on Initiative 19001,
which, among other protections, requires landlords to have a good cause for eviction, such as not paying rent, and adds up to 120 days written notice in certain cases.
If you do get an eviction notice, that it gives you enough time to go out, search, do your research and everything, and find the help that you might need.
It's an honor to be in front of you again.
The Federal Way law, along with a new similar rule in Burien, have provided some new impetus to a statewide good cause measure, an effort led by Representative Nicole Macri from the 43rd District in Seattle.
Both elected officials and voters understand the challenges that tenants are having.
Macri's good cause proposal, HB 2453, along with bills regarding move-in fees, security deposits, and even rent control, make up a set of laws intended to give renters a stronger voice.
Some bit of fairness, rebalancing that power relationship between landlords and tenants makes sense right now.
But some landlords say the state's plans don't make any sense at all.
It's crazy.
Rick Glenn of the Yakima Valley Landlords Association says he and every other property manager never want to evict a renter. But, he says, when there are problems with tenant relations, sometimes evictions are necessary, and new restrictions will only lead to higher business costs and higher rents.
Every time we turn around, the city government, the state government is making it more expensive to be a landlord. My tenants can't afford it.
And some landlords say a statewide good cause law will lead to public safety issues too.
I think the biggest problem that I'm concerned about is how dangerous this is.
Lindy Harvey manages 2,100 units from shoreline to tumwater. Under the Federal Way law, criminal activity is a good cause for which tenants can be evicted. But Harvey worries more tenant-friendly eviction laws will provide cover for people intent on using her properties for illegal activity, putting her law-abiding tenants in harm's way.
What do I say to them when I can't stop the crime? And what do I say to my employees when it's too dangerous for them to be working on these properties?
Many people are signed in today and wishing to testify.
The debate continues for state lawmakers as renters and landlords argue over how new eviction laws could impact our neighborhoods.
I feel like it's given a little bit of power to the renter.
Washington is setting an example for the worst type of government when it comes to housing.
And joining us to discuss these issues, we have with us Xochitl Maykovich. She is the political director for the Washington Community Action Network. Xochitl, good to have you.
Thanks.
We also have with us Roger Valdez, director for Seattle for Growth. Roger, good to see you again.
Thank you.
Here we go. I'm going to jump into this, and the state is working on a number of new protections for renters, as you know, this year. I'm going to look at the good cause measure, House Bill 2453, that's getting a lot of attention. And Xochitl, I'll start with you. You have advocated for this. You fought to pass a similar measure at the city level in Federal Way with this. What problem do you think this good cause measure would solve? What impact would it have if it's passed?
So this measure prevents retaliation and discrimination in the form of an eviction notice. So right now, landlords can end a tenancy very easily for no cause in most of the state of Washington. And so if you ask your landlord for repairs, for example, you risk getting a 20-day no cause notice in retaliation to that. In addition, and I think we can even see that with some of the comments landlords have made against this, there's issues with bias. You know, the majority of landlords are white men, and when you have when it's really easy for a landlord to push someone out, like for example, you know, the landlord can maybe smell some sort of drug and then assume that it might be the black tenant and then kick them out, and you have no way to defend yourself. And the important thing about good cause is that it just requires landlords to have a reason and to essentially prove the reason.
Got it. Okay. Roger, I want to get your thoughts on this. You're hearing what Xochitl's saying with regard to protections against retaliation. This is a good cause measure that would potentially provide that type of protection. Do you think it's fair to terminate a lease without a cause, for one? And what impact do you think this bill would have if it was passed?
Well, I think it's important to share something. You know, when I was 12 years old, my mom and I had to spend a week in a homeless shelter because we were facing the loss of our home. Fortunately, that didn't happen. When I was a nonprofit housing director and property manager, we had to evict a woman who, over 6 months, had a severe mental health crisis. And in spite of bringing to bear multiple agencies and our case manager, we were unable to help her, and we ended up having to remove her from the unit. I still wonder what happened to her and her children and the cost that is having on our community probably to this day.
Okay.
None of the things that are being proposed would have helped my mom and I back then, and they wouldn't have helped the woman that we had to try to help several years ago.
I think those are different issues.
The fact of the matter is that taken all together, what these proposals, including this good cause legislation, won't address the things that Xochitl's talking about ultimately, and what they will do is make it increasingly difficult for housing providers and for residents to be able to come together and find places for people to live.
And I'm going to touch on that in a second, but I need to ask again, do you think it's fair to terminate a lease without a cause?
I think it depends on the situation. When you say without a cause, you have to remember this is private property. This is an individual who is taking the risk of renting property to someone else. So I think 20 days is part of the law that exists currently. I think the issue is this going to help the kinds of things that it's claiming it will help. And the point is I don't think that it will.
And we're going to dive into that a little bit more in a minute. But Xochitl, I want to talk about some of this, because the bottom line, financially at least, I've heard from some property managers is, if a law like this is passed, making it more difficult to evict people, you'll end up pushing housing developers away. You'd reduce the amount of property managers who want to do business here in our state, reduce the amount of affordable housing we might have. How do you respond to that?
Well, my question is, why hasn't that happened over the past several decades in New Jersey, right? This law has existed in New Jersey since 1975. This has existed in Seattle since 1980, and many other jurisdictions throughout the country. It has existed for a long, long time. This is not a new idea. Washington is not being radical with this legislation. And you can look at the American Community Survey's data and see that there hasn't been a drop in rental stock in New Jersey. If anything, it's skyrocketed up. And this very basic protection that just requires a landlord to explain why they are ending a tenancy will not there's no proof that it will do all these things that people are saying.
Okay. Roger, let me turn this another way, because I think it's important to point out that some landlords, at least, do support this measure. At least they did last fall with this ballot measure in Federal Way. Many of the people surveyed about this said they believed a good cause measure was already in place. So why not put into law something a lot of people, and these are people outside of left-leaning Seattle, think is a good idea?
Well, let's look at, this is from the city's report on eviction, and you can see this long, drawn-out 10-step process.
It's a process, right.
The day one, when you start this, when someone doesn't pay their rent, for example, by the time you get to the end of this, if everything falls into place from the standpoint of the process of removing somebody, would be 21 days. Now, after this, because of Xochitl's activism, the legislature added 14 days to that process. So now, if there's a problem, whether it's a lease violation or a violent person or someone hasn't paid the rent, you're looking at the first of the month. Now you've lost 1 month rent, and now you're into the second month.
Okay.
So what we're seeing is an accretion of these measures that are just making it more and more difficult. So it isn't a question of, here's the stated reason why I'm removing you. You haven't paid the rent.
Okay.
If you ask anybody, we've done surveys, and 70% of people say, if you don't pay the rent, you're going to get evicted. So the issue is that the increasing number of rules at the state and local level are making it more and more difficult. And this is an ideal situation. You're looking at 60, 90, and now they want 120 days. Meanwhile, if a person hasn't paid rent and you have 3 or 4 units, you're not collecting that rent revenue to cover your costs. So it becomes a disincentive to provide housing.
Sochi, please.
One, as an author of that report, I think you were being very misleading with it. So one, this is your document. Let me explain.
So it's not misleading, it's fact.
So let me explain. So one, 120 days notice is for a landlord-based reason. For example, if the landlord wants to move into the property, or things along those lines, right? That's not a tenant-based cause. In addition, the vast majority of times, people, one, don't even go through this entire process because the time that you give the notice. Usually the landlord
works it out with the tenant.
That happens sometimes,
Sometimes that happens, but
most of the time.
So you're just saying that there's no actual data on that. What happens a lot of
your
times.
Report says your report says that page 16. That there are very few studies. And it also says it's difficult to track page 18.
So I'll finish explaining
what happens to the
saying.
tenants after.
Let's break it down, please.
Essentially, what happens is a lot of times, one, if it's something like non-payment of rent, because we extended the notice to 14 days, there's more chances for people to actually get the money to stay housed. And there's also more resources that have been put towards that. So for the non-payment issues, because of these reforms, so many people aren't even going through this entire process, and the landlord's getting paid. And then for other issues, such as, if a landlord is wanting to evict someone for criminal activity, if you they under the state law, they have a 3-day pay or quit, Which my question is, why would you wait 20 days to evict someone for extreme behavior instead of using that notice?
I think, let me follow up on that piece, because I don't think necessarily it's always extreme behavior. Some of the landlords I've talked to have said this good cause law would basically tie their hands such that it would give cover to people who might be doing something illegal, but maybe it's not rising to the level of a serious disturbance or whatever else. They have a lot of concerns about it. The neighbors have a lot of concerns about it. They don't want to wait around for a long investigation, et cetera. I'm telling you what they're telling me.
There's another cause in there for lease violations for 10-day notices, where if you're breaking the rules within the lease, they can give a 10-day notice. And the issue, honestly, is that landlords don't want to have to prove that the tenant is doing something. And I think a fundamental basis of our legal system is that you should have to prove an accusation.
A fundamental right, too, in our Constitution for private property, too, which I think is a piece of this.
Well,
and why a number of these issues are being challenged in court.
Here's the thing, is that this has existed since 1975 in New Jersey, so it's constitutional.
Let's talk about misleading. So there's page 17 and 18 of her report. There's no facts to support anything she's alleging. And so therefore it's dubious to impose even more of these regulations that are going to end up harming residents and housing providers.
Xochitl, I want you to respond
For
to
no
that, please.
benefit.
Well, I mean, I think the best thing would be if Roger actually read the methods section of the
I
report.
did. That's
and
where these
then
quotes
you
come
could
from.
understand
This is
how
the
we
methodology.
got.
Hang on, let's let her finish. Let's let her finish.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I know you
It's
really
your-
like
it's your
interrupting.
report.
All right, hang on.
So-
Please go.
So one, I don't even think that this conversation isn't one about the specifics of this report, which I will say was vetted, had a lot of efforts from people much smarter than me even involved in it. And a lot of it was about non-payment of rent, right? And again, because of the reforms the legislature passed last year, that issue is solved. The issue that is not solved is when the tenant wants to ask for repair and risk getting kicked out for that.
Yeah.
And I think the other important thing is, as you mentioned, a lot of people assume that you have to have a reason to evict someone anyway. And I don't
Right.
quite understand why it's so difficult to have to prove something.
Okay. We're going to touch on some of these issues specific to eviction in just a little bit. We are going to change gears a little bit here, moving from the state to the city level here. So we're talking about a plan to increase renters' rights at the city level. Seattle City Council member Kshama Sawant is sponsoring a ban on wintertime evictions defined as November through March. Now, advocates say this ban is a way to protect renters in the winter months who may have lost a job or gone through some other major life change. But many landlords say this plan illegally impacts their livelihoods, and they're recommending a different solution. Renting a home can be a challenge in Seattle's competitive real estate market. But losing that home due to eviction in Seattle's coldest months is even worse.
In District 3, statistics show that there is an eviction every other day.
That's why Council member Kshama Sawant has proposed banning any eviction in the city, aside from cases involving tenants committing illegal acts from November through March. In cases of non-payment of rent, landlords could still begin the eviction process, but the actual eviction would be delayed until April 1st.
Government has a moral and ethical duty to protect people from exposure to the elements.
Sawant points to a report from the Seattle Women's Commission and the King County Bar Association that studied more than 1,200 evictions in Seattle. In those cases, nearly 9 out of 10 renters evicted ended up homeless.
There are so many hundreds, if not thousands of tenants who are getting caught in what is a veritable eviction epidemic in our city.
To me, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Craig Swanson manages 2,600 units in 130 buildings from West Seattle to Ballard. And he says no landlord enjoys dealing with an eviction.
Nobody wants to kick anybody when they're down.
But he's concerned that if landlords simply give tenants a 5-month extension when they're behind on rent, it could turn into a problem for the property manager and the tenant.
And ultimately, it would seem to me that they would get farther and farther in arrears. We'd ultimately send them to a collection agency. The next time they go turn around to try and rent something, it's just a lot harder for them.
It seems that you could address this issue more effectively by providing emergency rental assistance.
Some smaller landlords and the Washington Multifamily Housing Association say it would be far more efficient and less expensive to use the city's and county's emergency rental assistance programs. The Housing Association says in 2018, the average amount of assistance was about $1,700. The average amount levied against a tenant in an eviction case, more than $4,000.
I would encourage you to provide funding to keep people in their homes instead of this proposal.
It's inhumane to put people out in the cold.
Yet advocates have successfully pushed this issue forward.
The winter eviction moratorium bill passes through committee.
And while the full council must still weigh in, landlords are left to worry about what the impact of an annual 5-month ban on evictions in Seattle will truly be.
To reduce homelessness, to save lives, to put people before profit.
It seems like a fake restriction almost that's going to come around and bite you on the other side.
And back to our panel discussion here. Your reaction to what the impact of the winter eviction ban in Seattle could be. Roger, let me start with you.
Well, it would do exactly what the advocates wanted to do, which is create chaos in the rental housing market. And wouldn't, again, when we look back at the report that they produced, there were 1,218 evictions filed out of 168,000 rental units
in the city, yeah.
Less than 600 were actually removed, about a third from SHA and nonprofits.
Yeah.
There's $3 million at least in the home base fund So this is a manageable problem that I think that doesn't require a ban on evictions in the wintertime. In other words, we can solve this problem with the resources we have today and perhaps even add to them, which is, I think, truly the humanitarian, compassionate thing to do.
Okay. Xochitl, your thoughts on this. Why is this needed? And Roger threw out some of the stats there.
Those numbers are incorrect.
Okay.
So that's the first thing.
Okay.
So a couple things about Washington. One, you can start the eviction process without filing in court. So if I'm evicting you, I can just serve you the complaint. And at that point, and so many people leave, and also you can't track that. The other thing is people leave at different points in time, right? So sometimes, and what we saw was that, one, the 1,200 number was the number of households who had an eviction filed against them. Then the close to, I can't remember the exact number, but 80 some odd % of those cases resulted in the tenant having to vacate. The important thing to remember is that, one, there's multiple cities and counties throughout the country that limit the execution of a writ, which is what we're talking about, right? Because eviction is like a colloquial term. It's not the actual, I think, legal term of what people are thinking about. This is just delaying the execution of the writ, writ of restitution. And there in DC, the sheriff doesn't execute the writ if there's a 50% chance of rain. Right. Or and in many places throughout the country, there's delays on temperature. So this is not a unique thing in the U.S.
I was going to say that when it comes to the dollars and cents and efficiency of this, when you look at these number of cases, even if there are 1,200 or whatever else, it would seem like a good use of money would be towards preventing those evictions from happening in the first place, rather than going through this process.
So one, we're totally on board with the idea of financial assistance, which is why we're supportive of Home Base that started after that report came out.
The King County program,
right. But the other thing is to remember is that while the majority of evictions are around non-payment of rent, that's not all. That's not all of the evictions that happen.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. And Roger, I wanted to talk about a very jarring statistic from that Losing Home report. More than 87% of the people evicted ended up homeless.
That statement is cobbled together from some survey data of apparently, I think, 44 people that they surveyed. And then there was, this is in the methodology section. And so I had to disclose those documents. I'm still waiting for them to find out exactly who they surveyed. But apparently it was a very small sample. It wasn't the 1,218 cases. In other words, they didn't survey the 558 people that were removed and find that 87% of them.
585 people removed.
So let's say it was all 1,200. It's false to say that those people, 90% of them wound up homeless. That's just false.
National research.
But that's not what you're saying. You're saying in Seattle, 87%.
I didn't say that. In that report, it said that out of the people we surveyed,
you just said
87% of people, which it was more than 44 people, by the way.
Roger, I think the connection here between homelessness and eviction is real, and that's something that the city council is trying to deal with. I wanted to make sure I got your reaction to it, because you have council members who are arguing this is a humane thing to do, to try to make sure that there's some eviction protection here because it's making people homeless. Homelessness is a huge issue in this city.
And I think we can address that in just the way that you mentioned, which is there's $3 million just for that purpose. So in other words, when you can go down to the eviction court, identify who's on the docket, talk to those people, it's a manageable number, and say, are you going to be evicted into homelessness? And if they are, say, what are we going to do to help solve that? Either solve the problem with the landlord, or better yet, go even further back than that and address the income issues and some of the other problems. If we do that, that's compassionate. But to just ban evictions in the winter is going to consign that person to certain eviction at some point in the future where the amount they owe is even going to be higher.
So one, again, because of the eviction reforms that passed last year, that has all been set up for non-payment of rent evictions, right? The landlord is forced to take the money. They can't say no if it's within the time frame, which they previously were able to say no, and they did. But the other thing to remember is, one, you're talking about life or death for folks, because people have died of hypothermia while being out on the street. And I think it is entirely compassionate to make sure that people are avoiding situations like that.
This is a controversial issue. There's no way around this. I want to make sure that I make that clear. And because I heard from a number of smaller sized landlords, they only rent out a few units that, let's say, they're saying this winter eviction ban would create a difficult financial situation for them. In terms of trying to get something across the finish line for the city here, would you support some sort of carve out such that landlords who only manage one or a handful of units would be exempt from a law like this? What do you think?
No, because we don't exempt. When I think about one of the things that will always confuse me is that restaurants are highly regulated with cleanliness, right? More so than rental stock, which is very bizarre to me. And I don't think you have people saying, well, this restaurant, I'm okay if they aren't following health and safety protocols because they're smaller. No, you have a very basic standard that you accept, and if they don't like it, they can sell the house. Like I hear people say, oh, well, if we have all these rental regulations, I'll just sell. And I'm like, go ahead.
Well, Roger, I'll throw the flip side to you. I mean, if the council was able to set up a fund for something like this to protect landlords who had some eviction problems going on.
Sochi's right. That's exactly what they're doing. Is they're selling.
But they're not actually doing it. They
are.
It, but they're not. Well, show me the proof.
Well,
where's the data? You're all up on data. I'm the one that actually went through all the data.
All right.
Come on.
Well, they are. And what we're hearing more and more is people that own single-family homes, for example, that are renting them out to 2 or 3 people, are selling them to an owner-occupier because they can't manage the thicket of regulations and rules. So we are going to lose housing stock. We are going to lose supply. And
so there's no actual data for that.
We're gonna see what pans out with that, and we need to start wrapping up the show. There's been a lively back and forth here. I appreciate that. I wanted to talk about a few things here. The winter eviction ban. We're talking about this just a few days before the City Council is expected to vote on it, and we've just heard from Olympia. Senator Phil Fortunato has proposed a bill which would block this ban from Seattle or any other jurisdiction from happening. Roger, maybe some final advice for Seattle city leaders working on the eviction ban, state leaders who are talking about just cause. We need to wrap up.
I just think step back. Let's look at how we can solve what I think is a solvable crisis for some people that are going through this, and start looking at how we improve the relationship between housing providers and residents. This is something that we can all address together rather than calling people racists and attacking them. And I think there's a way forward if we can come to that place.
Xochitl, final words here. Thinking about the council, thinking about our state leaders, they're working on some issues here with renters' rights. What do you want to tell them?
Well, I think nearly half the state rents, and that number's is increasing. I don't think there's any issues with taking similar ordinances and state bills that have existed for longer than I've been alive in other jurisdictions to make sure that we can have a safe and healthy community.
Okay, thank you both very much for this, and we will be right back.
I think tenants need more protections, mainly because we don't have hardly anything.
I don't have the capacity to let somebody stay in my place for free.
I just hope that it's fair and equitable for renters and for landlords.
The bureaucracy that Olympia is doing is costing lots of money.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Before we close today, it's time for our weekly CIO poll. Do renters need more protection in Washington State? Yes, no, or are you undecided? We want to know what you think. Cast your vote and weigh in with your comments at our website, seattlechannel.org/cityinsideout. While you're there, you can watch our programs online anytime. Coming up next week, concerns over public safety in downtown Seattle are growing after a recent series of violent shootings. What's being done about it? We find out next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.